te rangi pihama tērā, e kōrero mai ana mo tara aua mahi pūtai au, e whakamaramahia mai me pēhea tātou e mōhio ki te wā o te rā, te marama me te tau. Hei a pōpō ka haere anō ngā kōrero au o tātou tamariki mo ngā mahi pūtai au. E te whānau o te urukaraka, kai te mihi, kai te tangi, tēnā koutou. Ka tira e te iwi, hei ko nā rā.
Roro was produced and presented by Terry Harrison with the technical support of Richard Hulse.
Good evening, this is Gail Woods with Checkpoint on National Radio. In today's program, the latest on the terror attacks on the United States, we cross live to our correspondents in Washington and New York, and the government steps in to bail out Air New Zealand. First, Radio New Zealand News with Chris Witter.
New Zealand News with Chris Witter.
Good evening. A huge rescue operation continues after the terrorist attacks on the two World Trade Center towers in New York and the Pentagon in Washington. The heavy loss of life is made up of thousands, with 800 reported dead in the Pentagon, nearly 300 firefighters in New York, and thousands still under the rubble of the collapsed Trade Center towers. The BBC's Greg Barrow reports from New York.
New York is in shock, and as night falls, the city that never sleeps is like a ghost town. After the scenes of terror and devastation following the attack on the World Trade Center, millions of workers have eventually made their way home. Streets that are normally crowded with tourists and locals are now largely empty, and the area around the southern tip of Manhattan Island is sealed off. Rescue workers are struggling to get close to the base of what remains of the World Trade Center. The explosions in the building and the sheer weight of falling masonry as it collapsed to the ground has shaken the foundations of surrounding skyscrapers. One 47-story building, adjacent to what was the World Trade Center, has now collapsed, and there are fears that other structures in the area may have been damaged.
Greg Barrow reporting. President Bush says he'll make no distinction between terrorists and their hosts in the hunt for those responsible for killing thousands in attacks on the World Trade Center and Pentagon. In a televised speech from the Oval Office, he signalled that the US would pursue any country or government believed to have aided the terrorists. The president said thousands of lives had been suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. And he says Americans won't bow down to terrorists.
The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong.
President Bush. The 6 diplomatic staff at New Zealand's mission to the United Nations have spent the day trying to track down New Zealanders living in New York. 700 New Zealanders are registered as residents and about 100 have been contacted and are safe. But many other New Zealanders are believed to be in the city but unregistered. New Zealand's ambassador to the United Nations, Don Mackay, says tracking them down is going to be a hard job, made worse by poor communications in the wake of the attacks.
It's been a matter of trying to contact those people either by phone or by email or by friends. But it's going to take some considerable time to do this. Things are very chaotic. And those people who we can't contact by phone, we will have to try and physically locate, and that's going to be quite a big job.
Don Mackay, it's now the early hours of the morning in New York and diplomatic staff have stopped their checking until first thing tomorrow. A special debate in the New Zealand Parliament has heard all political parties join together to support the government's response to the terrorist attacks. The Parliament has agreed to send a motion to the US House of Representatives expressing grief and sympathy to the US people and government. The acting opposition leader, Bill English, told Parliament that the attacks remind us of our common humanity.
Now's not the time to dig into the causes and consequences of these events. It is sufficient to say that today has the feeling of a day on which the world has changed. Things will never be the same again.
Bill English. US officials fear the final death toll could reach 40,000. In other news, the decision by Qantas Airways not to buy Air New Zealand's ailing subsidiary, Ansett Australia, has come as no surprise to the Finance Minister Michael Cullen. Qantas was considering buying Ansett, which has placed its parent Air New Zealand in financial strife due to ongoing losses of more than $1 million a day. But having looked at Ansett's books, Qantas this afternoon announced it could not proceed because the problems are too great. Dr Cullen says this clearly makes Air New Zealand's position more difficult, but the rejection was not unexpected.
We always thought that it was much more likely they would not proceed, and I simply draw your attention to the reason they gave for not proceeding. This confirms what the government's been trying to say now for some days.
Michael Cullen, meanwhile, Air New Zealand is seeking Australian government support to keep Ansett flying. Under the proposal, Ansett will be liquidated and a new, smaller airline formed. A High Court jury has been told that alcohol doesn't begin to explain the bizarre behaviour of an Auckland doctor on the night he killed his terminally ill mother. Christopher Simpson has pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity to the murder of 82-year-old Marjorie Simpson. The Crown has argued that Simpson was drunk on the night and say that's the simplest explanation for his behaviour. But in his closing address, the defence lawyer Paul Davison QC told the jury that Simpson was suffering from a disease of the mind and didn't understand the moral implications of his actions. A man charged with the killing of an elderly South Canterbury man has been remanded in custody for a psychiatric assessment after appearing in the Christchurch District Court this afternoon. Raymond Lloyd Cullen, who's 45, was arrested in Christchurch this morning and charged with the killing of 65-year-old Desmond Leslie Payne in late July. Mr. Payne's body was discovered in his car behind a hotel in Geraldine, where he'd been having a lunchtime drink with friends. And that's the news.
On Sunday mornings, just after the 8 o'clock news, National Radio brings you Insight, a behind-the-scenes look at topical issues here and overseas. Each week, one of Radio New Zealand's investigative journalists presents an in-depth look at the issues, the people, and the background to stories of major interest. Insight, Sunday mornings just after 8 o'clock, and repeated Monday nights just after the news at 9 on National Radio.
Forecast from Weather Workshop to midnight tomorrow. Northland Bay of Plenty, also Gisborne. Often cloudy with a few light showers, but long fine breaks in Auckland. Drizzly rain spreading to most places tomorrow. Hawke's Bay and Wairarapa, a mix of fine and cloudy periods. Waikato to Wellington, also the Central Plateau. Fine apart from cloudy areas, chiefly north of Taihape, and along the main eastern ranges. High cloud developing tomorrow, but remaining dry. The South Island West Coast, a mix of cloudy and fine weather. The rest of the South Island mostly fine. A few areas of low cloud and fog possible overnight. The Chatham Islands, cloudy. It's 7 minutes past 5.
You're listening to Checkpoint with Mary Wilson. America and the international community are in a state of shock after the horrific terrorist attacks on the 2 World Trade Center towers and the Pentagon. The death toll is still unknown, but is expected to run into the thousands after 3 passenger planes slammed into the buildings this morning. President George Bush is promising a swift, certain and severe response. Night has now fallen on the scenes of carnage. From New York, Nathan King looks back on the day of terror.
Sounds of disbelief as the second of 2 planes careered into the side of the World Trade Center. Fire raged and some jumped rather than face the flames, and then the unthinkable happened. 200,000 tons of steel and 110 stories came crashing to the ground. One of America's most recognizable symbols of wealth and power, no more. Everywhere, New Yorkers were in shock. Emergency service teams trying to cope with an attack almost impossible to comprehend. This man was one of the few victims to get out of the World Trade Center alive.
Big boom, come down the steps, everything fine till we got to the basement, and then everything just fell in.
The emergency services struggled to cope. Every firefighter, every ambulance rushed to the devastation, the loss of life huge. Tyrone Dux, a New York City policeman, was rushed to the scene.
I'm hearing the fatalities are in the thousands over there. That's what I'm hearing, as many as thousands. That's what we're hearing. I haven't seen them bring anybody out alive.
New York has now declared a state of emergency. Warships are on their way to the Hudson and East River. Mayor Rudolph Giuliani says every one of New York's finest is on patrol.
The New York City Police Department is fully deployed, not just in the rescue effort, but all throughout the city of New York. offering as much protection and as much security as we're capable of.
Hospitals are overwhelmed and asking New Yorkers to give as much blood as possible, and many anxious relatives wait to hear about loved ones. The financial markets are closed, and in Times Square people look to the big financial screens not for stocks news but for more information on the unfolding tragedy watched by the world.
It makes you wonder what our intelligence community is doing, you know, to have something like this happen. How can this happen?
Very shocking, very shocking. I was standing down on 6th Avenue earlier, and I watched the flames coming out of the Trade Center, and I saw it collapse.
I felt horrified because it's like you don't know what's coming. They kept saying another plane coming, and all you hear was this rumbling. People was crying. People was jumping out the window.
It's difficult to find the words to describe how New York is feeling. New York City is in shock. One of its biggest landmarks has been destroyed. Thousands are either dead or injured, and the US is under siege. For Checkpoint, I'm Nathan King in New York.
A passenger aboard the ill-fated United Airlines Flight 93, which crashed outside Pittsburgh, called his mother from a phone on the hijacked plane. Mark Bingham, a 31-year-old California public relations official, rang his mother, Alice Hoagland. She describes the conversation.
I got on the phone, Mark, and he said, "Hi, Mom, this is Mark Bingham." Give me his last name. And he said, "I want to let you know that I love you. And I'm flying. I think he said I'm in the air. I'm calling you on the air phone of the airplane." In his seat. I presume so. He said, I want you to know I love you very much, and I'm calling you from the plane. We've been taken over. There are 3 men that say they have a bomb. And I said, "Well, who are they, Mark?" And he repeated that he loved me, and he said, I don't think he said, "I don't know who they are." He became distracted there, as if someone was speaking to him, and he said it's something to the effect of "It's true," and then the phone went dead.
Flight 93 was the only one of the 4 planes hijacked that did not hit a target. 45 passengers and crew were aboard the plane when it crashed, killing all on board. There is hope, though, that some people may have survived the World Trade Center catastrophe. New York's Mayor Rudy Giuliani visited the damaged buildings before they collapsed. Many police and city officials who went with them are now missing after staying to help with the rescue effort and being trapped when the Twin Towers toppled. The World Trade Center is headquarters for the New York Port Authority, and many are missing. But a short time ago, Mr. Giuliani told reporters that 2 officers have been rescued and there is hope for other survivors still trapped.
That's the good news, and all night we'll keep trying to extricate people through tomorrow.
Mr. Mayor, there are reports that there are a group of survivors in the basement of the World Trade Center, that they have cell phones. They've been calling their relatives in Seattle to tell them precisely where they are, and that there's a group of NYPD police who are with them and alive and well. Do you know about this? I
know that rescue effort's been going on for a couple of hours, yes.
The group of people with the cell phones that Marcia referred to, do you have any idea how big a group that size is in that particular location?
I don't think we know the exact numbers. We know it's more than 2 people. It's two people communicated, and they say there are more people there.
In New Zealand, the terrorist attacks dominated the opening of Parliament this afternoon. MPs stood for a few minutes silence, followed by statements from the leaders of each of the parties in Parliament. Our political editor, Al Morrison, compiled this report, beginning with a statement from the acting Prime Minister, Jim Anderton.
This is indeed a grim day. No country can be complacent. The perpetrators of this violence must be brought swiftly to justice. The international community must work together to find everyone who made this happen and see that they are punished. New Zealand will stand with all other democratic countries to do whatever is necessary to prevent and remove threats to peace and the devastating scourge of terrorism.
The Honourable Bill English.
Along with the government, we condemn with the deepest abhorrence a terrorist action unprecedented in nature. We condemn its perpetrators as well as the mindset behind this action. New Zealanders are foremost among the friends of the United States. We condemn the suffering that has been inflicted on that great nation, and we stand by them as they attempt to understand this invisible menace. It is a menace which threatens us all and defies the values which New Zealanders and Americans profess as free nations. Today has the feeling of a day on which the world has changed. We will stand with the international community and support the government's efforts in their attempt to better understand and better protect free people from this threat of terrorism.
Honourable Dr Michael Cullen.
Mr Speaker, it is hard to understand how anybody can believe that their cause, whatever it may be, is advanced by such actions. Indeed, even if their cause is a just one, the vast majority of people will be so revolted by their actions that they will lose sympathy rather than gain it. Mr Speaker, this week a United Nations conference was due to begin in New York. The conference would have brought together children from all over the world. A delegation of children, NGOs, public servants and ministers was to go from New Zealand. The conference was titled A World Fit for Children. We clearly have a long way to go.
The Honourable Richard Prebble.
We've actually had an act of terrorism from the skies in this country. I was at Eden Park, or more correctly, outside Eden Park, on the day when one Karl Marx Jones hijacked a Cessna plane and flower-bombed that park. The Air Force actually considered shooting down his plane that day, but rightly calculated that it wasn't safe to do so and arrested him when he landed. Today, members, we could have the option of being able to shoot down such a plane. This time next year, we couldn't. And I say to the government that they need to review all of our security.
Rod Donald.
Today we have witnessed a human tragedy of enormous proportions. This undeclared war also challenges our democratic foundations. The fact that it occurred on the United Nations International Day of Peace reinforces the perpetrator's callous disregard for the sanctity of life. No one could justify what has happened today. Neither can this attack justify indiscriminate retaliation. Even when the perpetrators are identified, and they must be punished, we would urge restraint and insist that a rash and violent response will only increase the loss of life, especially of the innocent. Today is a turning point for humankind. We dedicate ourselves to peaceful solutions to the challenges before us.
The Right Honourable Winston Peters.
We wish to add one small voice to the chorus of outrage coming from throughout the world. The criminals responsible for the planning of these outrageous crimes against humanity must be brought to justice. But justice also requires us to examine and then remove the base of hatred and fanaticism that give rise to such acts.
Honourable Peter Dunn.
These events have changed forever the way in which we will have to live our lives, even in as isolated a nation as ours. We cannot bow down, but I know that as we say that, we will in many cases be forced to accept changes, limits to our freedom, limits to our capacity to live our lives the way we did yesterday, as we seek to remove this cancer from amongst us.
And the terrorist action had a personal impact for one National MP, Clem Simic. His son Ricardo is a fashion buyer in New York and has been living just a block away from the World Trade Center. Ricardo and his colleague and fellow New Zealander, Maria Williams, witnessed the disaster. Clem Simic says his son rang home after the first building collapsed, but the phone went dead before the second building fell.
So they heard the noise and the sirens and that, and decided to go downstairs to see what was going on. And they did. And when they got out on the street, the first one collapsed. And then all of the people were rushing in for shelter into their foyer. And all of the glass front of their building was blown out too. And they were barefoot, no money, no papers, no nothing. And seeing the result of the second collapse, we were pretty worried. And that's probably the worst couple of hours we've been through.
Mr. Simic says Ricardo and Maria spent a few hours in hospital under observation and are now staying with friends in New Jersey. Foreign Minister Phil Goff says one of the first priorities for New Zealand is to find out if any New Zealanders have been killed or injured in the attacks.
We don't know precisely how many people we've got in New York. We don't keep a register, ironically, because it's not regarded as an at-risk area for New Zealand tourists. What we know is that we have 300-odd business contacts living long-term or permanently in New York. We suspect that the number of New Zealand tourists visiting there would be tenfold that number. We, as of yet, haven't been able to get a clear picture of what, if any, casualties that New Zealanders have sustained. We have approached the airlines, United and American. They have not yet been able to identify any New Zealand national travelling on the hijacked aircraft, but we do know for certain that there are New Zealand business people that do work in the World Trade Centre, both from our register and from the calls that we've taken on our 0800 number. So the big challenge facing us in the days to come will be to try to identify any New Zealander who may have been a victim of the tragedy that we've seen in New York this morning.
And it will take days.
I think it'll take days in the sense that the recovery of bodies will be extraordinarily difficult from the World Trade Centre. Anybody who's witnessed on television the collapse of the building would take that for granted. What we're doing, we've opened up an 0800 number. It's 0800 872 111. Between 8:45 this morning and 11 o'clock, we took more than 1,000 calls. Could I urge listeners, if they have friends or relatives living in South Manhattan or working there, by all means use this service, but people just looking for information, if they could get that information from the TV and not clog up the lines at this time, please.
And that's Foreign Affairs Minister Phil Goff. The 6 diplomatic staff at New Zealand's mission to the United Nations have spent the day trying to track down New Zealanders living in New York. About 700 are registered as residents in the city and about 100 have been contacted and confirmed as safe. Staff have also been given a list of around 100 tourists or temporary New Zealand residents in the city. New Zealand's ambassador to the United Nations, Don Mackay, says tracking them down will take several days.
Some people are not contactable at this stage. The telephones are out to the lower parts of Manhattan, and a number of people can't be contacted. Now, one doesn't want to read too much into that. I would suspect that at the end of the day, we will probably have to try and physically locate some people. That will take time. The Manhattan below 14th Street is cordoned off, is not open to people other than emergency personnel. It is going to be a time-consuming process, and I think it will be a number of days before the city here has a clear idea of the casualties. I mean, there are hundreds of people outside the hospitals at the moment trying to find their lists of their relatives on lists of names of casualties. It's very chaotic.
Do you know, in fact, if there were New Zealanders working in either of the towers?
We have evidence of one New Zealander who was working in the smaller building that collapsed later on, and that
Building 7.
Yes, that building was completely evacuated, as I understand it. I would not be surprised if there were other people, other New Zealanders, and others of those in the other buildings. There are about 40,000 people who work in the Twin Towers, so it's a significant number of people.
So your feeling is, in fact, that there will be New Zealand casualties?
I'm not saying that. I'm saying that I think that there will be New Zealanders who are caught up in the middle of this. I don't think there's any doubt about that, and we're already aware of some, but we're not aware of any casualties. We've learned of a couple of people who were admitted to hospital but subsequently discharged into the care of friends. We know of other New Zealanders who have lost their possessions and passports because they were staying in hotels down near the World Trade Centre. So we do know that there are have been New Zealanders caught up in this, but I would not speculate as to as to casualties. I mean, no one here is speculating.
And how are you and your staff?
We're fine. Our building is opposite the UN, which is in Midtown, so we weren't in the vicinity of the World Trade Center, and none of our staff live in the vicinity of the World Trade Center. But we did see it all unfolding. We have a clear view, or had a clear view, of the World Trade Center from our office, which is on the 25th floor of a high-rise building, and you have a clear view south to the World Trade Center. And so we saw the whole thing.
What did you see?
We saw initially one of the towers on fire. That was just before 9 o'clock. About 10 minutes later, we saw an explosion in the second tower and a huge amount of debris raining down from that tower. We didn't see the aircraft actually go into that tower because it approached from the south, and we're on the north side of the tower. But we did see a huge amount of debris. There was a huge amount of smoke, and subsequently we saw the two towers dissolve. And then there was just a vast pall of smoke and dust, and everything in the southern part of Manhattan was obscured.
Can you remember what you were thinking?
Disbelief, I think. I think everyone in Manhattan is in a state of shock. It was a sort of a slow motion, surreal nightmare, and that was, to those of us who were observing it from a distance. I mean, those who were caught up with it, and the people who lived the unspeakable horror on those aircraft. For them, it was a completely different type of experience. I mean, the whole thing is just sick, frankly.
That's New Zealand's ambassador to the United Nations, Don Mackay, and we've just heard Prime Minister Helen Clark has abandoned her trip to Europe because of the terrorist attacks and is now returning home. In Wellington, people have been placing flowers and cards at the gates of the US Embassy since early this morning. Many expressed their disbelief as the events unfolded, and all had their own story to tell.
I actually had a call from a friend, from my brother-in-law in the UK, 2 o'clock this morning, as he was being evacuated from a building. So that sort of kept me up most of the night, and watching the news coming through from there. Yeah, it's shocking. It's just shocking. I had a message from a friend who's I worked with a couple of months ago. He saw the incident happening.
It's probably a small response for an incredibly serious tragedy. It's hard to believe and hard to fit it into your head how such calamities could occur.
I have a nephew in New York and quite worried about him at the moment. Haven't heard anything and can't seem to get in touch.
Well, I've come down because there are Americans in my family, and my father fought alongside them in World War II, and certainly if we were called to fight alongside them again, we would.
It's pretty sad listening about it, hearing about it. Whole office is talking about it.
Deepest sympathy. It was just a heartache. It was a real heartache. I've just come to deliver some flowers and sympathy and respect. It's quite upsetting and very scary.
"28 minutes past 5, you're listening to Checkpoint on National Radio. Here is Patrick now with business news.
Good evening. The attack on the heart of world capitalism at the World Trade Center has had a damaging impact on world financial markets, closing the US markets and prompting falls of 5 to 8% on the major European markets. Asia has slumped in trading so far today, with Tokyo falling below 10,000 for the first time in 17 years. It is currently down 658 points, or 6.4% at 9,635. The Hong Kong Hang Seng Index is down 991 points, or 9.5% at 9,426. In this part of the world, Australia has lost 120 points, or 3.8% at 3,120. Investors around the world have been selling stocks and buying into the so-called safe haven currencies of gold, oil and industrial metals, with all of them recording sharp price increases. On our own local market, the top 40 index has closed down 91 points at 1873. Main changes include Auckland International Airport down 25 cents at $3.55, Air New Zealand A's down 14 at 57 cents, and the B's down 18 cents at 71. Contact Energy is down 7 cents at $3.21. Carter Holt Harvey is down 8 at $1.52. Lion Nathan is down 8 at $5.40. Telecom is down 30 cents at $4.35. Transrail down 20 cents at $4.12. And the Warehouse down 20 cents at $5.92. The Kiwi dollar lost some of its early gains as a measure of calm has settled on the currency markets. After trading as high as 43.6 US cents on the back of a sliding US dollar, it's now trading at 42.73 cents. It's also fallen against the currencies of our other major trading partners at 82.51 Australian cents, 28.99 British pence, 51 Japanese yen and 0.4691 euro. On the money markets, 90-day bank bills have fallen 26% at 5.57%. At 2011, government stock is down 27 points at 6.25. And Mary, that's business.
Thank you, Patrick. You're with Checkpoint on National Radio. It's 5:30.
Radio New Zealand News. The streets of New York were like a scene from a disaster film as people sought relatives and began a run on stores for food after the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center. There were queues outside shops in the city's Upper East Side as anxious families tried to buy food, fearing a shortage because of the attack. Others stocked up on water and bought huge bottles to take home. Above everything was the dust cloud from where the trade centre had been, while jet fighters regularly screamed overhead. A ray of hope emerged from the rubble of the World Trade Center as 2 police officers were pulled out alive and others trapped inside made desperate pleas for help via cell phones. New York Mayor Rudolph Giuliani says 2 police officers of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, which had its headquarters inside the Trade Center complex, were pulled out alive. The search is continuing for survivors who are believed to be trapped inside the remains of the 110-storey Twin Towers. Domestic luggage is now being screened in New Zealand. The government says people on flights coming and going from Auckland, Wellington and Christchurch will go through a thorough security check. Domestic passengers will be screened in a similar way to people travelling on an international flight. That means going through a metal detector and having all luggage x-rayed. Security at the main airports is also being beefed up. Air New Zealand is seeking Australian government support to keep Ansett flying while it turns its loss-making Australian subsidiary into a cut-price airline. Air New Zealand acting chairman Jim Farmer made the request to the Australian government just minutes after Qantas had rejected a proposal that it should take over Ansett. The Finance Minister, Michael Cullen, says the rejection was not unexpected. The body of an Australian climber has been recovered from a mountain ridge at the head of Lake Wakatipu near Queenstown. Police say he'd been buried in an avalanche below a ridge on Stair Peak to the east of Rees Valley. He was 43-year-old Emiel Christopher Ninans from Queensland, who was reported overdue last night. That's the news. Now sport, here's Stephen Hewson.
Good evening. The New Zealand cricket team has delayed its arrival in Pakistan in the wake of the suicide plane attacks in the United States. The team is currently in transit in Singapore and was due to arrive in Pakistan this afternoon, but will now remain in Singapore for a couple of days to give New Zealand cricket time to determine whether the side's safety is at risk if they continue to Pakistan. The Chief Executive of New Zealand Cricket, Martin Snedden, says the move is simply precautionary.
If Afghanistan or any terrorists from Afghanistan were involved in the attack, and if the United States decides to launch a response that Afghanistan borders on to Pakistan, and obviously there's, perhaps could be some problems arising from that.
Snedden says with the first one day not due to get underway for another week, the team has several days up its sleeve. New Zealand's only basketball player to make the NBA, Sean Marks, has given himself another week to sign a contract for the upcoming season. Otherwise, he'll head to Europe. Marks has trialled with the Miami Heat and the Seattle Sonics and is about to spend a couple of days with the NBA champions, the Los Angeles Lakers. The Canterbury lock, Brad Thorne, has dismissed suggestions he's about to make a mid-season return to the Brisbane Broncos League club, although he says he hasn't made any decisions about what he'll be doing next year, rugby-wise. And in Champions League soccer action this morning, Liverpool have drawn 1-1 with the Portuguese side Boa Vista, but Arsenal went down 1-0 to the Spanish club Real Mallorca in group matches. And Mary, that's sport.
Thank you, Stephen. American President George Bush is vowing to hunt down and punish those behind the unprecedented terrorist attacks today in the United States. It's not yet clear how many people were killed in the targeted attacks in New York and Washington. Vicky Ford reports.
US President Bush says those responsible for the attacks on the World Trade Center and Pentagon, which he has described as attacks on freedom, will be held accountable.
The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them.
2 hijacked planes deliberately flew into the World Trade Center in New York, demolishing the building's twin towers. About an hour later, another hijacked plane crashed into the Pentagon in Washington. Part of the building later collapsed. More than 260 people were on board the aircraft and thousands more were injured or killed on the ground. US Secretary of State Colin Powell says justice will be served.
You can be sure that America will deal with this tragedy in a way that brings those responsible to justice. You can be sure that as terrible a day as this is for us, we will get through it because we are a strong nation, a nation that believes in itself. You can be sure that the American spirit will prevail over this tragedy.
The attacks may have caused chaos and devastation to the country's financial and political centres and resulted in the Federal Aviation Authority taking the unprecedented step of grounding all flights in the US. But Defence Secretary Donald Rumsfeld says America will not be brought to its knees by such attacks.
The United States government is functioning in the face of this terrible act against our country. I should add that the briefing here is taking place in the Pentagon. The Pentagon's functioning.
There's been no claim of responsibility, and Palestinian groups Hamas and Islamic Jihad, along with suspected terrorist Osama bin Laden, have denied involvement. Though suggestions have been made, the United States' policies on the Middle East are to blame. Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon says the perpetrators must be found.
The fight against terror is an international struggle of the free world against the forces of darkness who seek to destroy our liberty and our way of life. I believe that together we can defeat these forces of evil.
It's believed no warning was given prior to the attacks, which US Senator John McCain says were clearly part of a carefully organised, sophisticated operation.
I think that it's clear that the organization and magnitude of the attacks required more than a few people to perpetrate it, and it'll take some time to determine who they are and who supported these attacks, but I think we'll find them out, and they will suffer the full measure of our justice. This is obviously an act of war that's been committed on the United States of America.
President Bush is facing the greatest crisis of his 9-month presidency, and perhaps the greatest crisis ever faced in peacetime by any US leader. And as the government and financial organisations try to get back to normal, thousands of people will have to put their lives back together as well. For Checkpoint, I'm Vicky Ford in Washington.
Joining us now is former diplomat Terence O'Brien, who is now a teaching fellow in international relations at Victoria University. Good evening.
Hello.
What was your response when you first heard about the attacks?
Well, one of complete shock and great surprise. But unfortunately, it does confirm a fact, which is that terrorism does constitute, in today's world, one of the chief security threats. And the sheer magnitude of this effort in the United States is making that very clear with an extremely large impact.
What precisely was needed to be able to pull this off?
Well, obviously, extremely careful planning and coordination. Timing and everything, and obviously American security in the sense of airport security and that sort of physical security was found wanting, no doubt about that. And it seems that American intelligence didn't have really very much by the way of foreknowledge, if any at all.
It seems extraordinary that it could have even happened.
Yes, it does, but it makes the point that I said at the beginning, that this is the sort of new scourge, if you like. I mean, terrorism of this kind is not necessarily intended to achieve a particular effect, a particular result. It's really a sort of what it is looking is of a demonstration effect to show the Americans on the one hand and the world on the other that this can be done, and it's sort of left like that. There's no, it's not. They're not seeking to destroy the United States or to bring the United States to its knees, or in that sense. Guerrilla warfare, which might be the next sort of step up the ladder, that's more connected with sort of breaking the will of of a country or a power. But this is a demonstration effect, and it's the most impactful demonstration effect you can possibly imagine.
Does it mean that inevitably there will be more attacks? Is this the beginning of something?
Well, that's an open question. They've certainly left an extraordinary impact as a result of this strike. Whether they would feel, and whoever they are, because it's still not clear where these terrorists came from, whether they would feel they needed to repeat this, seems to me to be debatable, at least repeat it straight away. Even if they could. And I think this exercise, obviously, as we said earlier, took a hell of a lot of planning. So they'd have to have some other plans in the pipeline right now. I don't know. I can't readily see them trying to repeat it, and especially now since the United States is on the alert.
A difficult question, but do you think that the US and its foreign policy can be held responsible in any way at all for this?
Well, I would like to answer that question by putting it in a slightly different way. I think when we have a chance for mature reflection, when we get over the enormity and shock of what's happened, and the United States obviously has to get over that more than anybody else, I think some serious thought needs to be given to what does cause this. What is causing it? There are, why does it happen? What policies might give rise to it, and so on. It's very interesting. One of the most distinguished achievements of American diplomacy in the last few years was what they did in Northern Ireland, where at their prompting, they cajoled the British into actually getting around the negotiating table with the IRA and so on. And this was a remarkable achievement, but in doing that, they looked at the total package and went back to the causes. What is causing this terrorism in that particular situation? And it was a real achievement. It's not a success yet, but they certainly pushed it a lot further than it's ever been before. That sort of approach is, I think, going to be needed in this case, if it is determined that some Middle Eastern interests are behind this.
Well, of course, the finger has already been pointed quite clearly at Osama bin Laden. And in fact, opposition forces fighting the Taliban in Afghanistan have said they believe it's a triangle between Osama bin Laden, ISI, which is the intelligence section of the Pakistani army,
right,
and the Taliban.
Right. Well, it's difficult to comment on that particular idea, but it does seem that the nature of the attack that's been carried out is of such sort of sophistication and sort of complexity that it is almost beyond the power of any one organization to have achieved it. So in that sense, there may well be something behind the notion that there's more than one hand involved in this.
Thank you very much for your time. That is former diplomat Terence O'Brien. Two other stories now, and Air New Zealand is seeking Australian government support to keep Ansett flying while it turns its loss-making Australian subsidiary into a cut-price airline. Air New Zealand Acting Chairman Jim Farmer made the request to the Australian government just minutes after Qantas rejected a proposal that it should take over Ansett. Under the proposal, Ansett will be liquidated and a new, smaller airline formed. Our business editor John Draper joins us for the latest. John, I guess no surprise really that Qantas said no.
No, it wasn't. It really didn't want to take on the $3 billion of debt that it thinks Ansett has. That $3 billion worth of debt would have increased Qantas's own debt quite substantially, would have increased it by perhaps about as much as 75%, and that was just too big a price to pay. Now, in the last few moments, the Australian government has come out and said that it has rejected Air New Zealand's request. It doesn't want to underwrite Ansett while it is restructured into a cut-price airline, and that's prompted Jim Farmer, Air New Zealand's acting chairman, to say that they're putting another proposal to the Australian government. He's also saying that the airline has received expressions of interest in Ansett from other potential purchasers, and he now wants the Australian government to underwrite Ansett for a little bit longer, or to start underwriting it, so that those prospects can be discussed. The Air New Zealand strategy at the moment really seems to be luring in the Australian government into supporting Ansett while its problems can be sorted out. But there is still hanging over that the ultimate decision there is to put a liquidator in, and that could still happen quite quickly. When
you say quite quickly, how soon might that be?
Well, I think they will, as soon as the Australian government indicates that it cannot or will not support Ansett, and these other expressions of interest are tested out to see exactly how much money might be on the table, because that's an alternative, then the Air New Zealand will be left with little option but to close down Ansett. It has to get rid of the losses, and it has to get rid of the debt, and the simplest way of doing that would be to liquidate the airline.
Well, what would possibly entice other airlines into being interested?
Well, it may not be other airlines. It may be other investors. Mr. Farmer's given no details of those, and we'll be pursuing those later on this evening.
So when do you think we might get a final decision and know whether or not Ansett will be closed or not?
I think everyone would like to know that, including our Finance Minister, Dr. Cullen. He said in Parliament this afternoon that he had not received a final restructuring proposal from Air New Zealand, and so therefore the government couldn't give any decision on it. Tomorrow we have the Air New Zealand's results meeting, when it's likely to unveil the losses. We'll have to unveil the losses that Ansett has incurred up to June the 30th, and it will also be certainly questioned about those ongoing prospects. It'll also be questioned about the restructuring package that it thinks it can put in place now, and what contributions Singapore Airlines, Braley Investments will make to that.
Thanks for that, John. That's our business editor, John Draper. Well, returning to our main story, and more stories of survival are emerging from the people who were in the World Trade Center when the airliners crashed into the landmark Twin Towers.
For some people, it brought back memories of the bombing. People had been there before when that happened. But I was amazed, really. When we got in the stairway, we were moving down. When the fire department were coming up, they say, move to the left. Everyone moved to the left, and everyone complied. A couple of people started crying a little bit, but we said we're going to get out of here. We just got to focus and take it one step at a time.
I heard people that were stuck on an elevator, on a freight elevator, because all the elevators went down, and water was going in, and they were probably getting drowned. And we get a couple of pipes and opened the elevator, and we got the people out.
As soon as it got hit, I was thrown to a window. So I was very lucky to get out. There's a lot of people that didn't get out. There's a lot of people coming down the stairs burnt up. They were lying on the floors, coming down the stairs. A lot of people had asthma attacks while they were coming down. It was bad.
When I look up, everything is coming down, and I start running as fast as I could, and we all jump under one of the fire trucks, right on time.
Emily Bird from Tie Happy has been working in the United States for 3 months. She emerged from a subway across the road from the World Trade Center just after the first plane struck the building. Checkpoint editor Don Rood asked her what she saw.
It looked like a fire about 3/4 of the way out. A lot of smoke coming out, and in the next minute, kaboom! And the whole thing just literally crumpled before us, and the street went into a panic. It was chaos.
So you arrived after both planes had crashed into the buildings?
No, we arrived in between them. We arrived after the first one and about 2 minutes before the second one hit.
Could you see the second one?
I didn't personally. I did not see the second plane going for it. I just caught the tail end of the explosion, and then it was just all on. saw the whole building just come down right in front of us, and the street went crazy because by this time a lot of people had gathered just to watch the fire, after the first one had hit.
So what did you do?
We stood there for as long as possible. I was on the top step of the New York Bank of New York, and watching the explosion, watching the whole building fall down. It looked like you see off the movies when they do a big demolition job and the buildings literally fall straight down. And the cloud of smoke was like, it came at us like a rate of knots. It was like about 50 knots. Just wound its way around the buildings and just went, woo, this massive cloud, and we dove inside the doors about 2 seconds before it was a complete blackout. We didn't go outside for about 20 minutes maybe, and we were scared to be inside the building that we were in because we were in the Bank of New York building, and we were like, whoa, what's going to be hit next? As soon as we came out, we came outside the building, we took a left to walk away from the World Trade Center, which is diagonal to where we were, walked away, and as we were walking away, the next rumble occurred, and it was the second tower collapsing. That gave us a hell of a fright. So, of course, everyone starts panicking again, running. There's people standing on the streets going, don't run this way, don't run that way, don't run. People are literally saying, don't run anywhere. Well, you've got to run somewhere. So everyone's like, you were just running for your lives, and you didn't know where you were running. You didn't know what was going to happen next.
So what is the reaction from New Yorkers around you while this was unfolding?
Absolute chaos. Absolutely chaotic. Like you would not believe. You know what Americans are like. They screamed and screamed, and everyone thought that the Third World War was about to happen right in front of their eyes. That's the kind of impression I got. People were literally fearing for their lives, running fast as they could out of there.
For the latest now, we cross to our New York correspondent, Owen Fay. Owen, what is the scene in New York now?
Well, Mary, it's quite calm just now. It's now just before 2 o'clock in the morning, and so the city is, as it usually is this time of night, fairly quiet. But the lower third of the city is still shut down. The police and the emergency services aren't letting any traffic through. They're not letting anybody who's trying to get into the area. It's completely blocked off in order that the emergency crews can carry out their work. They do know right now that there are some people trapped in the buildings who are still alive, and so they're trying to do their best right now to get to them.
How are the hospitals coping?
So far, the hospitals are coping fine. There haven't been an enormous amount of casualties that have been taken to them. And throughout the day, as you may well have heard, many New Yorkers had been going to the hospitals themselves in order to donate blood and to help out in any way that they can. However, the hospitals are expecting a massive increase in people over the next 24 hours, and they're preparing for either wounded casualties or unfortunately, for many dead.
Now, earlier in the day, there was news of 3 arrests in New York. Can you tell us more about that?
This is referring to the van.
Yes,
right?
That's right.
Yeah, there was a report that a van was making its way toward Manhattan in the evening that had been pulled over. There were 3 men inside it, and the initial reports were that the van was filled with explosives. However, the police commissioner has said that while the arrests were made, he was unable to confirm that there were explosives on the van. It may well be that that's just one of the rumors that's likely to fly throughout New York over the next few days as people try to find out who's responsible and if there are any further attacks being planned.
Can you give us a picture now of what you can see on the streets, the rubble, the debris?
Earlier in the day, I was down in the area just a few blocks from the actual site of the World Trade Center, and at the time there was rubble as far as you could see in a 3 or 4 block area. There was dust several inches thick, covering absolutely everything. Now the scene is there's lots of rescue teams, there's lots of heavy vehicles that are being moved in order to try to get as much of the rubble out of the way. Obviously, the superstructures of these buildings are so large that it's going to take a great deal of effort to actually just remove the buildings themselves in order to try to get to people trapped inside. So it very much looks like a siege state in the lower part of Manhattan just now.
And for New Yorkers, what do you think is in store for them, I guess, mentally over the next couple of days?
Well, a great deal of adjustment. The mayor went out of his way earlier, several hours ago, and he asked all of New Yorkers, first of all, not to come into the city if they didn't need to, and they've blocked off this lower portion of the city completely, so anyone who might work there won't even be able to get anywhere near it. But he's also cautioned, as have many other authorities on the scene, they've cautioned New Yorkers against trying to take any kind of revenge action. The mayor has made clear that communities in New York that are largely Arab will be protected by the police tomorrow in the event that there's any kind of vigilante action that's taken. So the hope is that people will do what they can to assist in the rescue effort just now, and then once that part of the operation has been completed, then attention will turn to who's responsible and why. But hopefully, while people are still shocked and stunned just now, the hope by the authorities is that people will cooperate with the rescue efforts for the next few days.
Have you seen any indication, in fact, that shock and disbelief is turning to anger, is turning towards particular communities?
There's signs that people are beginning to get increasingly angrier, although there's so little information, there's so little clear information about who is responsible and why, although there's all sorts of speculation, there are very few actual facts. Once those facts become clearer, then I think the anger will become more focused. At the moment, people are still stunned and shocked, and the prevailing mood here is still one of sadness, and it's likely to remain that way for the next few days.
Do you think people, though, have a sense that they are now at war against who they don't know, but they are nevertheless at war?
I don't think so quite yet, although it's very possible that will change. I think people right now are so overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of people that we're talking about that are missing, and the majority of them unfortunately presumed dead, that there isn't any move toward there isn't any mass move toward anger just now, although that's subject to change, and I think the authorities are preparing for that.
The authorities saying yet when they may have some kind of indicative death toll?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
The authorities saying when they may have some kind of indicative death toll?
Well, they're being very cautious just now for several reasons. One, in that any numbers that they may release now are likely to be surpassed very quickly. And the other reason, frankly, is that they want to avoid any sense of panic because the numbers are going to be very large. And they want to minimize any kind of activity that may compromise the rescue effort, that may complicate the effort. And so until significant numbers of people are removed from the buildings, they're going to be very cautious about releasing any statement, saying just now it's simply a matter of guessing, and they'd rather not do that.
Thank you, Owen. That's our correspondent in New York, Owen Fay. Well, church services are being held around the country for victims of the terror attacks, and ecumenical service is now being held in Christchurch Cathedral. Our reporter John McDonald is there, and he joins me now. John, what's happening?
Well, church officials I've spoken to estimate there's at least 500 people in the cathedral at the moment. The service started at 5:30, so we're certainly well into it. The congregation was welcomed by Dean John Black, who paid particular attention to American citizens who have come to the service, tourists that are in Christchurch who were visibly upset when they arrived at the cathedral, but also representatives of the American military who are based here in Christchurch, in particular Colonel Joel Maynard from the Air Force, who is here. Dean John Black passed on the sentiments from Christchurch, and I think we can safely say the whole of New Zealand, that today has been a despicable day, but more so for the American people.
How many people there, John?
Well, as I say, there's about 500, but that was shortly before the service started. People have continued to come in as the service has been going on. People I've spoken to, particularly Christchurch citizens, they say, when I've asked them why they've come along, they say, well, they feel this is the only tangible thing they can do to offer assistance and support to the American people. Of course, visitors to Christchurch, not just Americans, but from other countries, Germany, England, they say that they just want to be here to support the American citizens, in particular those that are here in Christchurch today.
And no sense of anger?
No sense of anger. It is a sense of disbelief, especially when the music started in the cathedral. It was a very poignant time, and people obviously are affected by it, but no anger. Still at this stage, it's a deep sense of shock and sadness.
Thank you, John. That's our reporter in Christchurch, Dom McDonald. And just a reminder now, a toll-free line has been set up for New Zealanders wanting more information about family and friends on the hijacked United Airlines flights 93 or 175. The number is 0800 445 432. People wanting information about relatives and friends in New York can ring 0800 872 111. That is a New Zealand Embassy line. Well, Radio New Zealand's coverage of the United States terrorist attacks will continue after 6 o'clock with World Watch. In that programme, Dinah Vincent looks at other terrorist attacks on the United States in the past decade. Former US Secretary of State Alexander Haig talks about the facilities that exist to protect the President and other key figures in times of emergency. And the Archbishop of Los Angeles offers advice to Americans trying to explain the significance of the day's events to their children. And that is our programme. It's 6 o'clock.
Radio New Zealand News, I'm Chris Witter. A special debate in Parliament has heard all political parties join together to support the government's response to the terrorist attacks in New York and Washington. Thousands are believed to have died when hijacked aircraft plunged into the World Trade Center towers in New York and the Pentagon in Washington. MPs have agreed to a motion to send to the US House of Representatives expressing grief and sympathy to the US people and government. The acting Prime Minister, Jim Anderton, told Parliament that New Zealand shares the feelings of despair and loss, grief and horror that are felt in the United States. The acting opposition leader, Bill English, told Parliament that today has the feeling of a day on which the world has changed and will never be the same again. Labour's acting leader, Michael Cullen, said there'll be immediate repercussions for the economy, but they pale into insignificance compared to the horror.
Kia ora tātou. This is Morning Report for Thursday the 13th of September with Sean Plunkett and Jeff Roberts. Coming up, George Bush warns the terrorists there'll be no escape from American justice.
This is an enemy that tries to hide, but it won't be able to hide forever. This is an enemy that thinks its harbors are safe, but they won't be safe forever.
We've the latest from New York and Washington as rescuers continue their search for survivors.
They're listening for sounds, obviously, to make sure that anybody caught in any type of voice, in any pocket, if they're alive, if they hear any sound. That's what they're doing right now.
And New Yorkers say they won't be beaten by the terrorist threat.
We will get through this because, as the Mayor indicated, New Yorkers come together.
First, Radio New Zealand News with Hewitt Humphrey.
Good morning. It's reported from Washington that senior US officials fear further attacks against American military, governmental and civilian targets. Sources in the US Capitol told our correspondent Simon Marks that there's evidence to suggest more attacks are being planned after the hijacking and crashing of 4 civilian airliners.
State Department sources now tell me that there is grave concern on the part of the Bush administration that the attacks against US civilian targets are not over yet. A source at the State Department says there is now credible intelligence that suggests, in his words, that these are just the first 4 of a series of attacks aimed at paralyzing America, its financial, governmental and civilian symbols. The entire US government is on a state of full alert, and this news will only serve to underscore the growing sense of fear across America that there are more terrorists out there hatching more deadly plans. Simon Marks, Radio New Zealand News, Washington.
Meanwhile, emergency workers are searching desperately for survivors in the rubble of the New York World Trade Center, which collapsed after being hit by hijacked airliners. There's still no death toll from yesterday's attacks, in which knife-wielding hijackers commandeered 4 planes. 2 ploughed into the World Trade Center, a third seriously damaged the Pentagon in Washington, and the 4th crashed in rural Pennsylvania. Rescue workers have pulled a handful of survivors from the wreckage of the Trade Center, and there are reports of at least one person calling for help on a cell phone. But the death toll is expected to climb into the thousands. Russian officials are urging the United States to join a global fight against terrorism instead of focusing on a missile defense shield which could not have stopped the airliner attacks. European Union foreign ministers have held emergency talks to offer a joint response to the attacks. They pledged help in search and rescue and in identifying the perpetrators, and are calling for a Europe-wide day of mourning on Friday. The Foreign Ministry in Wellington has confirmed that the only New Zealander known to have died in the terrorist attacks in the United States was Alan Bevan. Mr. Bevan, who was 49, had been in New York for 15 years. He was on one of the 2 hijacked United Airlines flights. The New Zealand mission to the United Nations in New York says it's traced about 200 New Zealanders known to live in the city. The Deputy Ambassador, Trevor Hughes, says they've been acting on requests for information phoned into the 0800 number in New Zealand. That number is 0800 872 111. Mr. Hughes says they've not heard of any New Zealand casualties on the ground. New Zealand pilots are eager to see more stringent security measures introduced at American airports in the wake of yesterday's terrorist attacks. Tougher security has been introduced at New Zealand airports while a review is underway. There are more armed police patrolling terminals, and domestic passengers are now subject to security checks. But the head of the Airline Pilots Association, Keith Malloy, says many pilots want to see improvements at US airports.
We're obviously concerned flying to any destination where there's risk, a security risk. Our pilots want to get home at the end of the day, so we'll be looking at to make sure that every measure is taken to make it safe for our pilots.
But Keith Malloy says ultimately very little can be done to prevent a terrorist attack. One of the main unions representing thousands of ANZET workers is taking Air New Zealand and the Australian government to court today in a bid to ensure that the airline pays their workers' entitlements. Air New Zealand placed its ailing Australian subsidiary in voluntary administration last night after numerous proposals to raise capital failed. ANZET will continue to fly, but has been losing $1.5 million a day. Our Australia correspondent, Stephanie Baird.
Fearing that some, if not all of ANZET's 16,000 workers will lose their jobs, the Australian Services Union has lodged an application in the country's Industrial Relations Commission to secure their entitlements. It claims the airline's parent, Air New Zealand, has a responsibility to pay entitlements worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And if it doesn't, the Australian government should cover the cost. Meanwhile, a group of ANZET pilots is frantically trying to raise finance to buy the airline to save jobs. Stephanie Baird, Radio New Zealand News, Sydney.
Trading in the shares of both Air New Zealand and its biggest shareholder, Briley Investments, will be suspended this morning pending an expected announcement later in the day of the airline's rescue package. Air New Zealand's acting chairman, Jim Farmer, says the company's key shareholders, Briley's, Singapore Airlines and the government, have reached general agreement on refinancing the New Zealand airline, but it can't be concluded before late this morning. The government's part of the package is expected to include raising the 25% ownership cap on Singapore Airlines holding and approving the merging of the resident-only A shares with the B shares available to foreign buyers. A federal appeal court in Melbourne will today hear an appeal lodged by the Australian government against a ruling that the Tampa asylum seekers be taken to Australia. The court ruled that the government illegally detained the more than 430 would-be refugees who were rescued by the Norwegian freighter Tampa last month. The government will argue that the asylum seekers were not detained and that the judge erred in ruling that it did not have the right to expel the boat people. Meanwhile, Eric Verlalis, one of the lawyers taking the case against the Australian government, says it's indicated it'll take a further appeal to the High Court if it loses today. Southern African leaders have established a committee to monitor the restoration of the rule of law in Zimbabwe, where President Mugabe has pledged to end a violent campaign of seizing white-owned farms. At the end of a two-day summit in Harare, heads of state from 5 countries urged the Mugabe government to establish a multi-party parliamentary committee to tackle economic problems. The leaders also want the committee to look into other contentious issues, such as campaigns against the opposition, media and judiciary. Detectives from Gisborne are investigating a suspicious death north of the city. A man has died at Tapuia Springs, north of Tokomaru Bay. The police are releasing few details, but say a man has been taken into custody. And that's the news. And now the sport, here's Richard Crowley.
Good morning. The New Zealand cricket squad have delayed their flight to Pakistan because of yesterday's terrorist attacks in the United States. The players who were in Singapore were due to leave for Pakistan on a flight yesterday, but have elected to stay put for at least the next 2 days. New Zealand Cricket Chief Executive Martin Snedden says with suggestions the attack could be linked to Afghanistan, and with that country bordering Pakistan, he has concerns should the US launch a military attack. Meanwhile, European soccer's governing body UEFA have decided to postpone this week's Champions League and UEFA Cup fixtures after yesterday's attacks. 8 Champions League matches were played yesterday before UEFA announced all remaining matches will be postponed. And security at next year's Salt Lake City Winter Olympics and the 2004 Summer Games in Athens will be reviewed following yesterday's events. The Games in Athens are already considered a target for internal threats, with attacks by leftist urban guerrillas in the past 26 years, killing 23 Greeks and foreigners. The Wellington brothers Martin and John Leslie and the New Zealand-born fullback winger Glenn Metcalfe have been included in the 25-strong Scotland rugby squad. That's for the Six Nations match against Ireland on Sunday week. However, Martin Leslie's in doubt. He's on crutches as a result of ankle damage. And that Murrayfield match is one of 3 Six Nations games postponed from earlier this year in an effort to prevent the spread of the foot and mouth epidemic. And Leighton Hewitt's triumph at the US Tennis Open has seen him become the 3rd player to qualify for the season's ending Masters Cup. Hewitt joins Gustavo Kuerten and Andre Agassi as early qualifiers for the $8.8 million event in Sydney in November. And that's sport.
The elephant is the only mammal that can snorkel at depth.
I came to neuroscience from studies of philosophy, asking, how do we see?
How the elephant got its lungs, how babies learn to see, and a bold new theory on the cause of diabetes this week on Eureka.
The process is analogous to Alzheimer's disease and BSE.
That's Eureka, Sunday at 2 and Monday evening at 7 on National Radio.
Now the forecast from Weather Workshop to midnight tonight. Northland to Coromandel Peninsula. Often cloudy with a few light showers, but mostly dry and sunny over Greater Auckland. For the remainder of the North Island, a mix of fine and cloudy weather. Afternoon showers about the central high country and the ranges of Gisborne and Bay of Plenty. The South Island west coast, also Stewart Island, a mix of fine and cloudy periods. Drizzle about the fjords and Stewart Island. The rest of the South Island, fine apart from low cloud and fog night and morning. And for the Chatham Islands, cloudy. The weather in the main centres, Auckland and Hamilton, cloudy periods, northeast winds, 16 degrees, Wellington sunny, northerly winds, 17, Christchurch, morning low cloud clearing, then fine northeast winds, 14 degrees, and Dunedin mainly fine with northeasterlies and a maximum of 15 degrees. It's just after 6:10.
You're with Morning Report on National Radio. To the newspapers, the New Zealand Herald's front page carries the headline, Terror in America, and a photo of firefighters dwarfed by the surreal ruins of the World Trade Center. The paper devotes the first 7 pages to the attack, saying the focus of blame is on Afghanistan-based terrorist Osama bin Laden, and the world economy may feel the repercussions of the devastation for years. The Herald also says Singapore Airlines has won government approval to lift its stake in Air New Zealand and lead a multi-million-dollar bailout of the airline.
The Dominion has a special wraparound this morning headlined, A Special Photographic Record of the Day That Shook the World. There's a full-page colour photo of the burning towers of the World Trade Center. Inside, the front page is headlined Apocalypse Now, above a large photo of the rubble that remains of the collapsed towers. And the paper identifies a New Zealand man, Alan Bevan, who was a passenger on one of the hijacked jets flown into the towers. The paper also reports that Ansett Australia has been placed in voluntary administration after Qantas rejected a plea to buy the troubled airline for $1.
Aftershock is the banner headline in today's press, which also devotes 8 pages to the story. There's a full-page photo of the collapsed towers of the World Trade Center, and the inside pages talk about Kiwis in New York and moves to rescue survivors from the rubble.
toll more than the US can bear, says the Otago Daily Times top story. The paper says casualties are expected to run into the thousands from the deadly attack on the World Trade Center as rescuers worked through the night digging for survivors. And the paper says 10 or more New Zealanders are believed to have been at work in the World Trade Center when the aircraft struck, and up to 1,000 others in the area. Well, those are some of the things in the papers this morning. We'll have more as the day progresses. Right now, time for the Pacific News Bulletin with Moira Tuileapa. Morning, Moira.
Good morning. In response to the attacks in the US, security has been stepped up in the Pacific. The US missile